G'day, mate. 40 here. So Steve Bannon, who ran Donald Trump's campaign in 2016, is now out of prison. And I see right-wing Twitter arguing that Bannon was wrongfully imprisoned by Democrats, and that if Democrats would do this to Steve Bannon, they'll do this to you too. Steve Bannon's entirely responsible for going to prison. He defied a congressional subpoena. It was his choice to go to prison. That's entirely on him. Same with Tommy Robinson, the anti-Muslim campaigner in Great Britain. He's now being sentenced to prison for 18 months. That's entirely on Tommy Robinson, right? He repeatedly violated his rules of probation. He did things that were going to get him arrested in the British context. So he essentially chose to go to prison. Same with Donald Trump. Right? Donald Trump hasn't been prosecuted just as a political tactic by the Democrats. Donald Trump has repeatedly said horrible things that would be sure to generate blowback. Right? Donald Trump is overwhelmingly responsible for Donald Trump's problems. Donald Trump loses the election, there's a good chance that he's going to prison, and that's largely on him. For example, when retired Admiral McRaven wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in January approximately of 2020, saying that we need a new president, that Donald Trump is unfit to serve. And then Stanley McChrystal, another retired general, went public with devastating criticisms of Donald Trump. Donald Trump took time in a meeting with his top military advisors, meaning the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of Mark Milley, of the various branches of the U.S. military, and said, let's recall McRaven and McChrystal back to active duty so that I can court-martial them. That's an incredible abuse of power. So it's not that Donald Trump is a fascist. It's that he lacks normal inhibition. He lacks a normal sense of respect for the rule of law. And he thinks in incredibly transactional terms. And one of the downfalls of Donald Trump's transactional thinking is that he often doesn't think beyond stage one. Right? If Donald Trump abuses power by recalling retired U.S. military generals so that they can be court-martialed for criticizing him, right? To an objective observer, that just sounds insane. So with Steve Bannon, Tommy Robinson, Donald Trump, all right, they face the prospect of prison, or they have served prison time primarily because of their own actions. Now, at the same time, the Democrats have politicized the justice system. They passed a special law to enable that successful prosecution of Donald Trump. And so, just as with Richard Nixon, right, Donald Trump gave his enemies a sword and they used it against him. So Donald Trump's lack of inhibition is what makes him so compelling a personality and so entertaining, and gives him the ability to stand up on stage and talk for 60, 80, 100 minutes. Right? Very few politicians can do that. And that's a wonderful quality. It also comes with a downside, that normal respect for process, rule of law, for precedent, tradition goes by the wayside with Trump. And so he really needs strong advisors who will stand up to him when he goes over the line. So I think Winston Churchill and a lot of other famous people in history have said, I'm just filled with ideas and 95% of them will be bad ones. And I need people to push back and tell me when I'm wrong. And that was how Winston Churchill operated. He was just constantly coming up with ideas how to prosecute World War II. And many of them, probably most of them, were crazy. And luckily for his side, he had people next to him who were willing to stand up to him and tell him that he was wrong. And Donald Trump, in his first term, had a lot of people next to him who were willing to stand up to him, refused to follow his orders and tell him that they were wrong. Now, sometimes that was for the good of the United States, sometimes that was not for the good. It is likely that Donald Trump's team will be less likely to say no to him in the second term, which does bring with it dangers. It's not a danger of fascism. Fascism was contingent. It was based on a particular time in history. It was a response to the threat of totalitarian communism. Right, Donald Trump is fascist is just a lazy accusation. But to say that Donald Trump is likely to abuse power or to not follow accepted norms, yeah, there's abundant evidence for that. But I guess it doesn't have the same compelling ring as Donald Trump is a fascist. All right, we're in Westwood, California, just outside of University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA. Where does treason rank in my assessment of injustices? I'm not comparing Trump to Churchill. I'm saying that there are a lot of people leaders who are filled with ideas, of which many of their ideas are bad. So treason is where you deliberately undermine your country, and it carries with it the death penalty. It's a serious offense, and there is a nihilism and a me-first attitude towards Donald Trump, which is dangerous, which is troubling. Even though I support Donald Trump, I recognize that many of the criticisms and the fears that people have about Trump have validity, but we're not choosing between a perfect solution and Donald Trump, right? We're choosing between two deeply flawed parties and two deeply flawed candidates. And so you have to weigh up the dangers that Donald Trump brings to the office and the dangers that Kamala Harris brings to the office, and figure out what issues are most important to you. So most important to me is the rule of law and safety. So reducing immigration, reducing illegal immigration, building the wall, a law and order ethos coming from the White House. That's what's most important to me. And that's a major reason why I'm supporting Donald Trump. He successfully crushed immigration in 2020. And then Biden overthrew those rules and allowed in a flood of illegal immigrants. And when we say that illegal immigrants commit rates at a lower rate than Americans, the United States has a subset of its population that commits an astronomical amount of crime. So do illegal aliens commit crime at a lower rate than white Americans or Asian Americans? I doubt it. So we have different groups who have very different profiles when it comes to criminality. Right? Asian women, white women, black women aren't going out there and murdering and raping people. Right? Murder is something that's overwhelmingly committed by young men, disproportionately committed by young black men. So it's now 2 days since the Trump rally at Madison Square Garden, and the media is retaining its focus on a joke told by an insult comic, Tony Hinchcliffe, at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally, that Puerto Rico is an island of trash in the Caribbean. I don't know what the level of trash is in Puerto Rico. I was there for 2 weeks in 1980. But if Puerto Rico has a trash problem, then the joke lands. If Puerto Rico does not have a trash problem, then the joke doesn't work. Just as Ryan Gadurski, the conservative commentator, in the midst of a heated conversation on CNN with Media Hassan, who essentially accused him and Trump supporters of being Nazis, Ryan Gudersky responded, hope your beeper doesn't go off. Now, if Media Hassan has a history of support for terrorists, support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and the like, then that joke lands. If Media Hassan has no such history, then the joke doesn't land. Gudersky made a mistake by immediately apologizing and trying to explain his joke and saying that, he thought that Media Hassan said he supported Hamas, when Media Hassan said he supported Palestinians. Right. There's an appropriate time for apologies and inappropriate time for apologies. When you're in the midst of a panel discussion about whether or not Donald Trump supporters are Nazis, that's not a time to apologize to your opponents. Right? The type of rhetoric and humor that's appropriate in that context where you're accused of being a Nazi is different than in a good faith conversation. You have to notice whether you're in a dunking competition or in a good faith conversation. And Ryan Gudersky was not in a good faith conversation. And so his joke was appropriate to the context. And when you make a joke, don't explain it. It either lands or it doesn't land. I don't know enough about Media Hassan to judge whether or not that joke was appropriate to him. But it's certainly appropriate in a context where you're accused of being a Nazi. You fire back because you're not in a good faith conversation. And so CNN fired Ryan Gudersky on the basis of civility. So there's nothing incivil about calling Trump and his supporters fascists and Nazis. But to make a pager joke to Media Hassan, that violates civility. So civility is used by those who dominate our culture and our media to tilt the discussion. And so it's not the left-wing bias of our institutions and our media and of CNN that bothers conservatives, it's that they don't acknowledge the bias and they pretend that they are above hero systems, they're above bias, and that they're just enforcing civility. But they're enforcing a particular type of civility which allows for their side to call Trump supporters fascists and Nazis, and that's no violation of civility. Also, civility is just one virtue. There are a lot of other competing virtues. So a really good joke that's incivil, right? If the power of the humor is high, then that should outweigh a lack of civility. If a remark is touching on a blunt truth, right? Sometimes truth is far more important than civility. It wasn't civil to say publicly that Joe Biden appeared senile, but Joe Biden has appeared senile since 2017. It's uncivil to acknowledge that, but it's also true. Right? Civility is not always more important than truth. And one thing that gets no attention in the news media discussion of that joke about Puerto Rico is, does Puerto Rico have a littering problem? Does Puerto Rico have a trash problem? Right? Are there different groups that tend to litter far more in the United States than other groups? And there are all sorts of sites in public parks in Upper Manhattan and in Los Angeles, where after disproportionately Latino gatherings, there are huge amounts of trash. So there is a problem in a segment of Latino life with littering. And that gets no attention, right? Not every group operates with the same level of care, conscientiousness, and civility and sense of public duty. So all sorts of blunt truths get dismissed by the news media as racist and sexist and Islamophobic and homophobic. But the sex lives of homosexuals are not the same as the sex lives of heterosexuals. The average homosexual man has over 100 sexual partners. right? The average heterosexual man has about 5 partners in a lifetime. When you have a lot of sexual partners, you're much more likely to get certain diseases. Monkeypox is overwhelmingly right now situated in the gay community, as AIDS in the United States has overwhelmingly occurred among men practicing barebacking and intravenous drug users. So I know discrimination is supposed to be the most evil thing, but disease and crime discriminates. And the people most likely to get murdered are those who are hanging out with criminals and likely murderers, and who do things that infuriate those who are disproportionately likely to murder you. Right? Most murder victims were not just studying the Bible and leading law-abiding lives prior to getting whacked. There are things that you do that will predispose you to HIV infection or monkeypox, or to getting murdered, or to getting victimized in innumerable ways. So whether it's Steve Bannon or Donald Trump or various sacred minorities, right? Most of us play a role in our own misfortune. And the invention of these non-existent moral ills of racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, ageism, lookism, they blind people to basic truths. Right? You will see the world less clearly if you buy into these bogus moral categories of racist, sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic, and the like. So the news media feels like it's done its job with the Puerto Rico jab, but not even asking, not even considering, not even investigating, not even looking into, does Puerto Rico have a trash problem? If Puerto Rico has a trash problem, the joke lands. Media San has shown sympathy or support or taken funding from terrorist-friendly organizations, then the joke lands. If he hasn't, the joke doesn't land. So different groups produce very different communities, right? You go to a Japanese-American community, it's not overrun by trash. It's very orderly, it's neat, it's clean, it has low crime rates. Right? That's a reflection of Japanese-American culture. Chinese communities in America are more rambunctious and loud than Japanese communities. But Chinese Americans overall have a low crime rate, high education rate, low rates of STDs. Right? Different groups get different rates of sexually transmitted diseases depending on the reckless or careful way that they go through life. So what makes Steve Saylor great is that he investigates data and studies and the news in part based on his own life experience. When public pronouncements differ dramatically from his own life experience, he calls that out and he investigates. So it's not that one's own first-hand experience is inevitably correct, but it's worth investigating. If public pronouncements dramatically differ from your own first-hand experience, what exactly is going on? How do you deconstruct that? So there are many topics that academics are discouraged from researching. For example, the connection between physiognomy and crime. There are studies that indicate that murderers do have certain physical traits, such as disfigurement in the face. But you're not supposed to study that. So in reaction to this caution, people on the right will sometimes tweet physiognomy as destiny. And in my life experience, physiognomy often gives a clue to people's character. I sense that I can get somebody's political orientation often just by looking at them. I can often get a sense of their sexual orientation just by looking at them. Get a sense of whether or not they're likely to be violent just by looking at them. Nature, for example, is constantly color coding animals for our benefit. There are certain colors that go along with certain dangers in nature. And why would people not also demonstrate physical, tangible signs of their dispositions in politics, towards violence, towards sexual orientation, towards following laws, towards conscientiousness? My life experience, you get a great deal of insight just by looking at someone. I often feel like I get a strong read on people just by listening to them. The quality of their voice. Is it strangled? Is it strong? Is it tentative and weak? Gives me a profound read into somebody's character. But academics are discouraged from researching these un-PC topics. So criminologists in academia, they're about 98% on the left. New York Times yesterday had a long article about how Kamala Harris's campaign has shifted over the past couple of weeks from discouraged to optimistic. And it felt very much like an artificial story that various Kamala campaign operatives decided that they needed to place a different type of story to change the vibe that Trump has all the momentum. So on the objective end of things, that it appears that Trump's momentum is holding. And it would make sense why Kamala Harris's campaign would want to put forward a different message. Right? That would seem to be very much in their self-interest. But the New York Times article just does not ring true. So how I like to understand the news is that I want to read the best perspectives from all over the political spectrum and then compare them with my own life experience and try to figure out which ones ring true and which ones ring false. I'm walking around Westwood, California right now. We're about 5 miles east of the Pacific Ocean, 5 miles east of Santa Monica. So one clue that you're reading some bogus narrative is when it relies on these bogus moral categories of racist, sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic. Right, someone can make a racist, sexist, homophobic remark and it might still be true. And to me, truth is far more important than these artificial and bogus moral constructs. So we're now a week away from the election, and it still feels like the Kamala Harris campaign is reaching for the news. Right? They don't have a consistent message to drive. Right? They're just looking for anything that will land with possible undecided voters. And it is a characteristic of a campaign that knows it's losing. Right, Trump has a clear message. Right, we got a crime problem, we got an immigration problem, we got an inflation problem. But the Democrats are able to coordinate their messages with the news media. The Democrats and the news media, elite news media, just constantly feeding off each other. There doesn't need to be much factual foundation for some damaging story to run against Trump and the Republicans by the New York Times and the Atlantic. And it just still smacks of desperation to me. So Mark Halperin put out an email a few minutes ago. He said the odds of a clear Trump victory were about 15%. The odds of a close Trump victory were about 40%. The odds of a close Kamala Harris victory were about 40%. So Republicans exhibit supreme confidence, which they did not exhibit in 2020. And you won't get many, if any, Democratic political professionals exhibiting strong confidence that Kamala Harris is going to win. So I'm enjoying the Bob Woodward book, War. I was watching the World Series last night with the sound off most of the time while listening to the audible version of the new Bob Woodward book on Joe Biden's foreign policy team and how it's handling the wars in the Middle East and in and around Ukraine. And it's striking how sympathetic Bob Woodward is to those who talk to him. So obviously the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, talked to Bob Woodward, and the book is very pro-Anthony Blinken. You get everything from Anthony Blinken's perspective. The book is also very pro-Joe Biden, it's very pro-Joe Biden's team. And Woodward portrays Joe Biden's foreign policy team as professionals whose excellent strategizing will be studied for generations to come. Because this is a team that spoke to him. They gave him the inside story. On the other hand, Bob Woodward didn't get any sources close to Bibi Netanyahu. So Bibi is portrayed as horrible, as duplicitous, as incompetent in this book. And yet, when you compare almost all the advice that the Biden administration gave to Bibi versus what he eventually did, in almost every occasion the Biden team's advice turns out wrong. Right? The Biden team said, don't go into Rafah, don't go into Rafah. You'll never be able to get 1 million people out of Rafah quickly. And Israel was able to get 1 million people out of Rafah within a couple of weeks. There were a few civilian casualties. That's where Yahya Sinwar was killed. That's where they discovered that Egyptian border guards were allowing constant flow of arms into Hamas. And so that's why Egypt was so strongly opposed to Israel going into Rafah, because it would expose the corrupt nature of their border guards in relationship to smuggling to aid Hamas. But Bob Woodward just takes the Biden team and other Middle Eastern Arab countries at their word. So there's a strong lack of judgment in Bob Woodward's book. It's entertaining because the principals on the Biden team spoke to him. So you get to hear how they experienced things. But there's very little judgment and discretion used by Bob Woodward. He's acting as a stenographer for the Biden administration in this book. And we're seeing the Middle East getting remade by Israel. And Israel's taking out the trash of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran by ignoring, overriding, undermining the directives that they got from Joe Biden's team, and consistently proving that they are right and that they are more effective and they can do all the things that the Biden team said they could never pull off. So Israel's taking out the trash in the Middle East. And there might be a problem with certain groups in the United States and Puerto Rico who don't take out the trash. And there's nothing racist and bigoted about noticing which groups take out the trash and which groups don't take out the trash. For example, when Japanese fans go overseas, they often take out their own trash. Right? When they're at a stadium, they have members of the group who pick up the trash. when tech types go to the Burning Man event, they very carefully pick up the trash. On the other hand, you just go to public parks in Upper Manhattan and Los Angeles after certain minority events, and the parks are just filled with trash. So the New York Times began its 3-part series on Tucker Carlson a couple of years ago with Tucker Carlson's remark that immigration has made America dirtier and poorer. And they don't investigate whether or not what Tucker said is correct. They just focus on it as an example of his nativism and racism, and how Tucker says things that nobody else has said on cable news. So not all groups exhibit identical levels of conscientiousness. Right? We should have a government and a society that rewards and praises groups that behave in a conscientious manner, such as picking up their trash, and stigmatizing and blasting and criticizing those groups that behave in a reckless manner. When I walk around in Australia, I don't worry that if I bump into someone that they'll immediately want to start a fight. But with many residents of Los Angeles, that has to be my first concern. If I accidentally bump someone, right, they'll look to turn it into a fight. If I protest that someone's bad driving, I much more reason to fear that someone in Los Angeles is going to pull out a gun than in Australia. So I was asked by an American, why is Australia so safe? And I said, well, Australia was overwhelmingly founded by people from Great Britain, and they have reproduced the low levels of crime that you see among the native British. And I heard a comment by a longtime resident of Beverly Hills that I no longer feel safe in Beverly Hills because I see a substantial increase in criminal behavior. And then she added, I don't want to sound racist. I'm not going to say any more. But when different races commit different levels of crime, right, it's not racist to observe that reality. There's no such thing as racist. There's just real and fake. There's authentic and stilted. Right? There's genuine and there's performative. And the careful critical discourse that the news media and CNN insist upon, right, makes it much more difficult to share blunt truths. Careful critical discourse of the educated class precludes the kind of blunt truths that different groups have different gifts, different groups have different levels of conscientiousness on average, that different groups commit different levels of crimes and different types of crimes, that different groups produce very different neighborhoods. Nathan Coffness has a long essay out this morning on how the woke are still winning. His thesis is that if we don't accept that different groups have different gifts, then wokeness becomes the default because you look for institutional racism to explain group differences. But if different groups have different gifts, right, you don't have to reach for these magical incantations of institutional racism. Coffness says you're not hearing so much about cancel culture because you usually can't cancel people twice, that those in danger of being canceled have become much more careful in what they say and have often bent the knee to the politically correct, and that those operating cancel culture have become more selective and effective in how they use the tool. So the ideology that dominates the anti-Israel college protests is anti-settler, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist. But you never hear them applying that kind of ideology to Iran. Right? Iran has effectively occupied Lebanon for the past 20 years. Prior to that, Syria was occupying Lebanon. So by arming Hezbollah has been the most powerful military force in Lebanon. It's a proxy for Iran. And effectively, Iran has occupied Lebanon. It's occupied Iraq. The Iraqi government doesn't do anything that Iran doesn't approve of. It's funded Hamas, so through its proxy Hamas, Iran has effectively occupied Gaza. And now with Israel's success against Iran and its proxies, right, Sunni Arab states, right, are rejoicing, even if they can't say so publicly. So the anti-imperialist ideology only runs when it can be operated against white people. When Iran is the imperialist, right, it doesn't get any pushback. So I read a lengthy article in The Atlantic this morning on why blacks have so much sympathy for the Palestinian cause. And it's a completely bogus premise. Right? Historically, black colleges in the United States had few anti-Israel protests. Right? American blacks overwhelmingly don't care about the Middle East. They are much more focused on their own group. So there's been a lot of news articles and books and academic analyses on the Jewish-Black alliance. But Jews and blacks lead about as separate lives as you could possibly find in America. Right? Occupy different places in the socioeconomic spectrum, work different jobs, live in different neighborhoods. But occasionally, right, activist leaders will come together from the different groups to pretend that there's some kind of Jewish-Black alliance. And there are some self-interested, ambitious activists who want to imagine a great black Palestinian alliance. And it's just not there. You're far more likely to get anti-Israel protests at UCLA in Columbia than at any of the historical black colleges. What the heck is going on with Dak Prescott? He's like the Kamala Harris of NFL quarterbacks. Dak Prescott is the Dallas Cowboys quarterback, and just as Kamala Harris seems to be going through the motions of mouthing words that have been written for her, I mean, Dak, when you see him playing, he just seems to be going through the motions of NFL quarterback. He's the highest paid player in the NFL, and yet he shows no fire, no enthusiasm, no leadership qualities. He's just going through the motions as he plays disastrously game after game, throwing the ball to the other team. Dak Prescott, receiver C.D. Lamb, and cornerback Trayvon Diggs, they all got massive contracts, and they've all given up making an effort. So an NFL team has to be very careful about who it gives big contracts to, because a lot of players, they stop making an effort. Zeke Elliott, the Cowboys gave him a huge contract back in 2018, and he was never the same after that. final week of the campaign, checking out Sean Spicer's show. He had Jim McLaughlin, the #1 Donald Trump pollster, on his show last night. So Sean Spicer still sees the odds favoring Donald Trump substantially. Nate Silver has moved the election in Trump's favor. Betting markets place the odds at about 2/3 likely that Donald Trump will win. Donald Trump continues to campaign like a winner, showing joy, fun, ease, while Kamala still campaigns like a loser, desperately trying to seize on headlines of the day to gain traction with a message that's just all over the place. She was on Shannon Sharp's show and did herself no favors.